The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and morning frost as Corporal James Mitchell adjusted his grip on his rifle for what felt like the 100th time that morning, standing at his post outside Windsor Castle. He had been on duty for nearly 3 hours, his red tunic immaculate, despite the October chill that seemed to seep through even the thick wool of his ceremonial uniform. At 26 years old, James had served as one of the Queen's Guard for 4 years, but today felt different in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The morning had begun like any other, with the familiar ritual of preparation that every guard knew by heart. Rising before dawn, James had spent over an hour ensuring every aspect of his appearance met the exacting standards expected of someone representing centuries of British military tradition. His black bearskin hat had been brushed until it gleamed, his brass buttons polished to mirror brightness, his rifle cleaned and inspected with the meticulous care that had been drilled into him. During countless hours of training, James came from a military family that stretched back for generations. His great-grandfather had served in the trenches of World War I. His grandfather had fought in North Africa during World War II, and his father had completed tours in Northern Ireland. During the Troubles, the Mitchell family had a tradition of service that ran deeper than duty. It was woven into the very fabric of who they were as people. Growing up in a small town in Yorkshire, James had always known he would follow in his family's footsteps. But unlike his predecessors who had served in active combat roles, James had been drawn to the ceremonial duties of the household division. There was something about the precision, the discipline, the living history of the role that appealed to his sense of purpose and pride. The training to become a Queen's Guard had been among the most demanding experiences of James's life. Months of drill practice, learning to stand motionless for hours in all weather conditions, and studying the intricate protocols that governed every aspect of ceremonial duty. He had mastered the precise timing of the changing of the guard, learned to ignore distractions from tourists and photographers, and developed the mental discipline to remain focused and alert even during the longest and most monotonous duties. Windsor Castle on this particular morning was quieter than usual. The tourist season was winding down as autumn settled over the Thames Valley, and the usual crowds of visitors were smaller and more subdued than during the busy summer months. The ancient walls of the castle seemed to absorb the morning mist, creating an atmosphere of timeless dignity that never failed to remind James of the historical significance of his role. As he stood at his designated position, James's trained eyes continuously scanned his surroundings while maintaining the stoic expression that was expected of his position. His peripheral vision had been honed through years of practice, allowing him to observe a wide field of view while appearing to stare straight ahead with unwavering focus. This skill was not just ceremonial, it was a practical necessity for someone charged with the security responsibilities that came with guarding royal residences. The grounds around Windsor Castle were meticulously maintained, with manicured lawns and carefully tended gardens that created a picture of British perfection. Ancient oak trees, some of which had stood for centuries, provided a canopy of golden and amber leaves that rustled gently in the morning breeze. The sound was peaceful and rhythmic, creating a natural soundtrack that helped mark the passage of time during long hours of duty. James had always been an excellent marksman, a skill that had been evident from his earliest days of military training. His instructors had noted his natural steady hand, his ability to control his breathing under pressure, and his instinctive understanding of trajectory and wind conditions. These abilities had served him well throughout his military career and had contributed to his selection for the prestigious role of Queen's Guard. During his off-duty hours, James often participated in competitive shooting events, representing his regiment in various military competitions. His personal rifle, a precision instrument that he maintained with obsessive care, had helped him win several regional championships. But the weapon he carried during ceremonial duties was different. A historic rifle that was part of the traditional equipment of the Queen's Guard, maintained more for its symbolic significance than its practical applications. On this particular morning, something in the atmosphere felt charged with possibility, though James couldn't identify exactly what was creating that sensation. Perhaps it was the quality of the light filtered through the autumn leaves and morning mist. Perhaps it was the unusual quietness of the tourist areas, or the way the ancient stones of the castle seemed to hold the crisp air. Whatever it was, James found himself more alert and focused than usual. The routine of ceremonial duty involved long periods of absolute stillness punctuated by precisely choreographed movements and position changes. James had learned to find a kind of meditation in these extended periods of motionlessness, using the time to maintain his mental focus while remaining constantly aware of his surroundings. It was during these quiet moments that he often reflected on the weight of tradition he carried and the countless guards who had stood in similar positions throughout British history. As the morning progressed, James noticed a small commotion. Near the visitor entrance to the castle grounds, a family with young children was having difficulty with what appeared to be a large dog that was becoming increasingly agitated by the unfamiliar surroundings. The animal, a beautiful golden retriever with a thick coat that gleamed in the autumn sunlight, seemed to be pulling against its leash and showing signs of distress. The family appeared to be tourists, possibly American based on their clothing, and the way they were consulting a guidebook and pointing toward various features of the castle. The father was trying to calm the dog, while the mother attempted to manage two small children who were becoming upset by their pet's obvious anxiety. It was the kind of minor drama that played out regularly in tourist areas, usually resolving itself without any need for intervention. However, James's trained eye noticed that this situation was developing differently than usual. The golden retriever's behavior was escalating beyond simple anxiety or excitement. The dog was beginning to show signs of genuine distress, panting heavily despite the cool morning air, and its movements were becoming more erratic and unpredictable. The animal's golden coat was now damp with perspiration, and its eyes had taken on the wide and focused look that often preceded panic in animals. The family's attempts to calm their pet were having the opposite effect, with their own rising anxiety and frustration only adding to the dog's stress. The children were now crying, which created additional noise and chaos that seemed to be pushing the animal closer to a complete panic response. Other tourists in the area were beginning to notice the situation, and some were moving away from the family, creating a wider circle of open space around the increasingly distressed animal. James maintained his position and outward composure, but internally, he was assessing the developing situation with the analytical skills that had been drilled into him during his military training. His experience told him that this was not a situation that would resolve itself naturally, that intervention might soon become necessary to prevent the situation from escalating into something more serious. The golden retriever suddenly broke free from its collar with a powerful jerk that caught the family completely by surprise. The leather collar, which had apparently been loosened to make the dog more comfortable during their sightseeing trip, slipped over the animal's head with ease. Now free and in a state of panic, the beautiful dog began running in erratic circles, its golden coat streaming behind it as it searched desperately for an escape from the overwhelming stimuli of the unfamiliar environment. The situation had just transformed from a minor tourist inconvenience into something that could potentially become dangerous for everyone involved. The golden retriever's escape created an immediate ripple effect throughout the castle grounds that James could feel even from his stationary position. What had been a peaceful morning scene was rapidly transforming into something much more complex and potentially dangerous. The dog, now running free and driven by pure panic, was no longer the well-behaved family pet that had arrived with the tourists just minutes earlier. Panic had completely taken over the animal's normally gentle nature. The golden retriever's eyes were wide with terror, and its usual friendly demeanor had been replaced by the unpredictable behavior of a creature operating purely on survival instincts. The dog was running in increasingly erratic patterns, its powerful legs carrying it across the manicured lawns and pathways with desperate energy. James watched through his peripheral vision as the situation continued to deteriorate. The family was now in complete chaos, the parents shouting conflicting instructions to each other while trying to chase their escaped pet. The children were crying loudly, their distress adding to the cacophony of voices and sounds that seemed to be driving the dog further into its panic state. Other tourists in the area were reacting with a mixture of concern and self-preservation. Some people were trying to help by forming a loose circle around the running dog, hoping to contain its movement and guide it back toward its family. However, their well-intentioned efforts were actually making the situation worse by creating additional obstacles and sources of stress for the already overwhelmed animal. The golden retriever's panic was manifesting in ways that were becoming increasingly dangerous. The dog was no longer paying attention to its surroundings, running blindly across pathways where other visitors were walking and narrowly missing collisions with elderly tourists who were unable to move quickly enough to get out of the way. James could see that several older visitors were now at risk of being knocked down by the panicked animal. An elderly woman with a walking stick was directly in the dog's path, moving too slowly to avoid what appeared to be an inevitable collision. A man in a wheelchair was positioned near one of the garden areas where the dog seemed to be heading in its chaotic flight pattern. The sound of the dog's family shouting, children crying, and other tourists calling out instructions was creating a wall of noise that seemed to be amplifying the animal's terror rather than calming it. The golden retriever was now running with its mouth open, tongue lolling out, breathing in the rapid, shallow pants of an animal in extreme distress. Castle security personnel had noticed the commotion and were beginning to respond, but they were positioned too far away to intervene immediately. James could see two guards moving toward the scene from different directions. The distance they needed to cover and the speed at which the situation was developing meant that several more minutes would pass before they could take any effective action. The dog's erratic running pattern was taking it closer to areas of the castle grounds that posed additional dangers. There were ornamental ponds where the animal could potentially injure itself, steep stone steps that could cause serious harm if the dog fell, and decorative iron fencing with sharp points that presented obvious hazards to a panicked animal running. Without awareness of its surroundings, James found himself in an unprecedented situation. His training and protocols were clear about maintaining his position and not breaking his ceremonial role, except in the most extreme circumstances. However, his experience and judgment were telling him that this situation was rapidly approaching a point where someone could be seriously injured, either the dog, an elderly tourist, or possibly both. The golden retriever suddenly changed direction again, this time heading directly toward the area where James was stationed. The dog's path would take it past several more elderly visitors and toward a section of the grounds where the potential for serious injury was even greater. James could see that the animal's panic had reached a level where it was completely beyond responding to human voices or attempts at direction. As the dog approached his area, James was able to observe its condition more closely. The golden retriever's eyes showed the telltale signs of extreme panic, pupils dilated despite the bright morning light, rapid eye movements that indicated the animal was unable to focus on any single stimulus, and the kind of desperate expression that animals display when they're fight or flight. Instincts have completely taken over their normal behavior patterns. The dog's physical condition was also deteriorating rapidly. Its golden coat was now soaked with perspiration, its breathing was labored and irregular, and its movement was becoming less coordinated as exhaustion began to compound the effects of panic. James recognized the signs of an animal that was approaching complete physical and psychological breakdown. The family's attempts to recapture their pet were becoming more frantic and less effective with each passing moment. The father was now running full speed across the castle grounds, calling the dog's name at the top of his voice, but his shouting only seemed to drive the animal further away. The mother was trying to manage their crying children while also attempting to coordinate the recapture effort. But her divided attention was making both tasks more difficult. Other tourists were now actively trying to help, but their good intentions were creating additional problems. People were calling out different instructions, trying to approach the dog from multiple directions, and creating a chaotic environment that was overwhelming an already panicked animal. The golden retriever was now responding to every human movement as a potential threat. Dodging away from anyone who came near, James could see that the situation had reached a critical point. The dog was now running toward an area of the grounds where several elderly visitors were gathered, including a group of tourists from what appeared to be a senior citizen tour. These visitors were not physically capable of moving quickly enough to avoid a collision with the panicked animal, and James could see that at least one serious injury was now virtually inevitable. His military training had prepared him for split-second decision-making under pressure. and his experience as a marksman had given him confidence in his ability to make precise, controlled actions even in stressful situations. James began to consider options that would have been unthinkable just minutes earlier. When this had seemed like a minor tourist inconvenience, the protocols governing his behavior as a Queen's Guard were strict and clear. But they also included provisions for situations where public safety was at immediate risk. James had the authority to break from his ceremonial role if he determined that intervention was necessary to prevent serious injury or danger to visitors on the castle grounds. The golden retriever was now less than 50 meters away, enclosing the distance rapidly. Its path would take it directly through a group of elderly tourists who were gathered near one of the castle's historical markers. Reading information about the site's history and completely unaware of the approaching danger, James made his decision. In a movement so swift and precise that most observers would later say they barely saw it happen, he raised his rifle to his shoulder.
Ow.
The weapon, despite its ceremonial role, was fully functional and had been maintained to the same standards as any military firearm. James's years of training and natural marksmanship ability combined in a moment of perfect coordination between mind, body, and equipment. The morning air was still and clear, with minimal wind to affect his aim. The distance was well within his comfortable range. His target was large enough and moving in a predictable enough pattern that he could be confident of his accuracy. James controlled his breathing, found his natural point of aim, and prepared to take a shot that would prevent what appeared to be an inevitable tragedy. But as he settled into his shooting position, something unexpected happened that would transform this moment from a simple intervention into something far more profound and memorable. The golden retriever, perhaps responding to some subtle change in the energy around it, suddenly stopped running and looked directly at James. For just an instant, human and animal made direct eye contact across the castle grounds, and in that moment, everything changed. The moment when James's eyes met those of the panicked golden retriever across the castle grounds seemed to stretch into an eternity, though in reality it lasted only seconds. In that brief instant of connection, something profound and unexpected occurred that would transform not only the immediate situation, but James's understanding of his role and responsibilities as a guardian. The rifle felt steady and familiar in James's hands as he maintained his aim, his years of training having created an almost automatic response to the developing crisis. His breathing was controlled and rhythmic, his stance was perfectly balanced, and his finger rested gently on the trigger with the precise pressure that indicated readiness without commitment. Every aspect of his marksmanship training was engaged and ready for action. But as he looked into the golden retriever's eyes, James saw something that gave him pause. Beyond the obvious panic and terror, there was an intelligence and gentleness that spoke to the animal's true nature. This was not an aggressive or dangerous creature, but a beloved family pet that had been overwhelmed by circumstances beyond its understanding or control. The dog had stopped running and was now standing motionless about 30 meters away, sides heaving with exhaustion and stress. The golden retriever's beautiful coat was matted with perspiration, and its pink tongue hung from its mouth as it panted rapidly in the cool morning air. But its eyes, those deep brown eyes that had captured James's attention, showed a flicker of awareness that transcended the panic. James found himself in an unprecedented situation that his training had never specifically addressed. He had raised his weapon with the intention of firing a warning shot to startle the animal and redirect its movement away from the vulnerable tourists. It was a reasonable tactical decision based on his assessment of immediate danger and his responsibility to protect civilians in the area. However, the sudden stillness of the golden retriever had created a new set of circumstances that required a different kind of response. The immediate threat to the elderly tourists had been reduced, at least temporarily, by the dog's decision to stop running. But James could see that the animal was still in a state of extreme stress and could resume its panicked flight at any moment. The castle grounds had fallen into an unusual quiet, as if everyone present had suddenly become aware that something significant was happening. The family's frantic shouting had diminished to worried whispers. Other tourists had stopped their attempts to approach the dog, and even the children's crying had subsided to soft sniffles. It was as if the entire scene had been placed on pause. Waiting to see what would happen next, James maintained his shooting position, keeping the rifle trained on an area near the golden retriever where a warning shot would be most effective. His plan was to fire into the ground at a spot that would create enough noise and disturbance to startle the animal without causing any physical harm. The shot would serve to redirect the dog's attention and movement, while also signaling to security, personnel, and other authorities that intervention was needed. The silence stretched on, creating a tension that was almost palpable. James could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, though his peripheral vision told him that most observers were too far away to fully understand what was happening. To them, he appeared to be a Queen's Guard who had raised his weapon in response to some perceived threat. But they couldn't know about the split-second calculations and assessments that had led to this moment. The golden retriever continued to stand motionless, its breathing gradually slowing as the brief pause and activity allowed some of the panic to subside. James could see that the animal was beginning to show signs of awareness of its surroundings, looking around with less frantic energy and more focused attention. The dog's ears, which had been flattened against its head in fear, were beginning to move more naturally as it processed the sounds around it. James made a decision that would demonstrate both his tactical judgment and his understanding of the deeper responsibilities that came with his position. Instead of firing immediately, he chose to wait and observe, maintaining his ready position while allowing the situation to develop further. His finger remained ready on the trigger, prepared to act instantly if the dog resumed its panicked running. But he gave the animal a moment to calm itself. The decision required tremendous discipline and confidence in his own abilities. James was essentially betting that his marksmanship skills were sufficient to allow him to respond instantly if the situation changed, while also gambling that a few moments of calm might be enough to prevent the need for any intervention at all. As he held his position, James became aware of the profound silence that had settled over this section of the castle grounds. The usual sounds of tourism, conversations, footsteps, camera clicks had almost completely stopped as people recognized that something unusual was happening. Even the background noise of London traffic seemed muted, creating an atmosphere of focused attention. The golden retriever took a tentative step forward, and another, its movement now showing more coordination and less of the wild energy that had characterized its earlier flight. The dog's tail, which had been tucked tightly between its legs in fear, began to show slight movement that suggested decreasing stress levels. Its mouth closed partially, and its panting became more regular and controlled. James could see that the animal was beginning to respond to the calmer environment that had been created by everyone's decision to stop chasing and shouting. The golden retriever was demonstrating the resilience and adaptability that made its breed such beloved family companions. Gradually recovering from its panic as the immediate stressors were reduced, the family, recognizing that their previous approach had been counterproductive, had stopped their frantic attempts to recapture their pet. The father stood still about 20 meters away, speaking in low, gentle tones that carried just far enough for the dog to hear. The mother had managed to calm their children, and the entire family was now projecting a sense of patience and control that was much more likely to be effective. Other tourists had also recognized the change in dynamics and had stepped back to give the situation more space to develop naturally. The elderly visitors who had been in potential danger were now safely out of the way, guided by other tourists and castle staff who had quietly moved them to a more secure area. James maintained his aim but began to feel a growing sense that the crisis was resolving itself without the need for his intervention. The golden retriever was continuing to show signs of improvement, and the overall environment had shifted from chaotic panic to controlled patience. His tactical assessment was that the immediate danger had passed, though he remained ready to act if circumstances changed. The dog took several more steps, this time in the direction of its family rather than away from them. Its movement was cautious and deliberate, showing none of the wild unpredictability that had characterized its earlier behavior. The golden retriever's eyes were now focused and aware, tracking the location of its human family and beginning to show recognition of familiar faces and voices. James realized that he was witnessing something remarkable. the power of calm, patient response to overcome panic and fear. The Golden Retriever's recovery was demonstrating the same principles that his military training had taught him about crisis management: that steady, controlled responses were often more effective than dramatic or aggressive interventions. The dog continued its cautious approach toward its family. James began to lower his rifle, though he maintained readiness to raise it again instantly if needed. The movement was slow and deliberate, designed not to startle the animal or create any sudden changes in the environment that might trigger a return to panic. The Golden Retriever paused and looked directly at James again, and in that moment, both human and animal seemed to acknowledge that they had shared something significant, a demonstration of restraint, patience, and the power of choosing calm response over reactive intervention. The transformation that unfolded across the castle grounds was so gradual and beautiful that many observers would later describe it as almost magical. James continued to lower his rifle slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled to avoid creating any sudden changes that might startle the Golden Retriever back into panic. The weapon returned to its ceremonial position with the same precision that had characterized every aspect of this extraordinary encounter. The Golden Retriever, now showing clear signs of recognition and returning calm, began walking more confidently toward its family. Each step was deliberate and purposeful, showing none of the frantic energy that had driven its earlier flight across the castle grounds. The dog's tail had begun wagging tentatively, and its ears were moving naturally as it processed the familiar sounds of its human family's voices. James maintained his disciplined stance but found himself profoundly affected by what he had just witnessed and participated in. The decision to hold his fire, to wait and allow the situation to develop naturally rather than intervening immediately, had required a level of judgment and restraint that went beyond his formal training. It had been a moment that tested not just his technical skills, but his understanding of when action was truly necessary and when patience might be the wiser choice. The family's reunion with their beloved pet was touching to witness. The father approached slowly, speaking in the gentle, reassuring tones that dog owners use with frightened animals. "Easy, boy. That's it. Come here. You're safe now." His voice carried relief, love, the kind of patience that comes from genuine understanding of an animal's needs. The children, who had been crying with fear and confusion just minutes earlier, now watched with wide eyes as their family dog gradually returned to its normal, gentle nature. The younger child, a girl of perhaps 6 years old, whispered to her mother, "Is Max okay now?" The question carried the innocence and concern that children feel for their beloved pets. The mother, who had been managing both her own anxiety and her children's fear throughout the crisis, now showed visible signs of relief as she watched her family's Golden Retriever walking calmly toward them. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing became more normal. In the drama, were now able to resume their normal activities, though many continued to watch the reunion with interest and concern. Elderly visitors who had been moved to safety were now able to return to their sightseeing, though several stopped to comment on the remarkable way the situation had been resolved. James could hear fragments of conversation from the dispersing crowd. "Did you see how that guard handled that? The dog just calmed down when everyone stopped chasing it. It could have been really dangerous. Never seen anything like that before." The comments revealed that many people had recognized something unusual, significant about what they had witnessed. Castle security personnel who had been approaching the scene were now able to slow their response, recognizing that the immediate crisis had passed. However, they continued their approach to ensure that the situation was fully resolved and to offer assistance if needed. Their professional assessment was that the incident had been managed effectively without requiring their direct intervention. The Golden Retriever reached its family and was immediately surrounded by gentle hands and loving voices. The dog's tail was now wagging enthusiastically. Its body language showed complete relief at being reunited with familiar people in a calmer environment. The family's joy at having their beloved pet safe and unharmed was evident in their faces and their gentle handling of the animal. James watched this reunion through his peripheral vision while maintaining his ceremonial position and outward composure. However, Internally, he was processing the profound implications of what had just occurred. He had been prepared to take decisive action to prevent injury, but the situation had taught him something valuable about the power of restraint and the importance of allowing circumstances to adulate before committing to irreversible actions. The father of the family looked up and made direct eye contact with James across the castle grounds. In that moment, a silent communication passed between them: gratitude, respect, an acknowledgement of what the guard had done by choosing patience over action. The man nodded slightly, a gesture so subtle that only James could see it, but one that carried profound meaning. James found himself thinking about his grandfather's stories of military service, particularly the tales of moments when split-second decisions had determined the outcome of dangerous situations. His grandfather had always emphasized that the mark of a true soldier was not just the willingness to act when action was needed, but the wisdom to know when restraint was the better choice. The golden retriever, now wearing a hastily improvised leash made from someone's belt, seemed completely transformed from the panicked animal of just minutes before. The dog was alert and interested in its surroundings, but in the natural, curious way of a well-adjusted pet, rather than the frantic desperation that had characterized its earlier behavior. The family began to move toward the castle exit. Clearly, recognizing that their pet needed to be removed from the stimulating environment that had triggered the incident. However, before leaving, they made one final gesture that would remain etched in James's memory for years to come. The father approached as closely as protocol would allow and spoke in a voice just loud enough for James to hear. "Thank you, we saw what you did, how you handled that. You could have. But you didn't. Thank you for understanding." His words were simple, but they carried a depth of gratitude that spoke to his recognition of the guard's remarkable judgment and restraint. The family's departure was quiet and dignified, with the golden retriever walking calmly beside them, showing no signs of the distress that had nearly created a dangerous situation. Other tourists who had witnessed the incident continued to comment on what they had seen, many expressing admiration for both the guard's handling of the situation and the family's patience during the resolution. James returned to his normal ceremonial duties, but the experience had changed something fundamental in his understanding of his role. He had always known that his position carried both symbolic and practical responsibilities, but the incident with the golden retriever had demonstrated how those responsibilities sometimes required decisions that went far beyond the scope of formal training or written protocols. The morning resumed its normal rhythm, with tourists continuing their visits and the castle grounds returning to their usual atmosphere of dignified calm. However, several visitors approached other guards throughout the day to comment on what they had witnessed, describing it as one of the most impressive displays of professional judgment they had ever seen. Word of the incident began to spread among the castle staff and security personnel, though the details were communicated with the discretion that was typical of professional military environments. James's immediate supervisor approached him during his next scheduled break to discuss what had occurred and to commend him for his handling of an unprecedented situation. "Mitchell," the sergeant said quietly, "that was textbook crisis management out there. You assessed, you prepared, you waited for the right moment, and you chose the right response. That's the kind of judgment we hope for, but rarely see tested so dramatically." The words carried the weight of professional recognition from someone who understood the complexity of what had occurred. As James reflected on the morning's events, he realized that the golden retriever had taught him something profound about the nature of panic, calm, and the power of patient response. The animal's recovery had demonstrated that sometimes the most effective intervention is the decision not to intervene, at least not immediately, but to create space for natural resolution to occur. The incident would become part of James's personal understanding of what it meant to serve as a Queen's Guard, not just the ceremonial duties and traditional protocols, but the deeper responsibility to make wise decisions under pressure, to protect without causing unnecessary harm, and to understand that sometimes the greatest strength is shown through restraint rather than action. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors to Windsor Castle, but word of the morning's incident had begun to spread in the way that remarkable stories do in close-knit communities. James noticed that several tourists were looking at him with particular interest, and he overheard fragments of conversations that suggested people were discussing what they had witnessed or heard about from others. "That's the guard who handled the situation with the dog this morning," one elderly visitor whispered to her companion as they walked past James's position. "My friend Margaret saw the whole thing, said it was the most professional thing she'd ever seen." The comment was spoken with the kind of reverence that people reserve for moments they recognize as genuinely significant. James maintained his ceremonial composure and outward focus, but internally he was still processing the profound implications of the morning's events. The decision to hold his fire and allow the situation to develop naturally had required a level of judgment that went beyond anything his formal training had specifically prepared him for. It had been a moment that tested his understanding of when action was truly necessary and when patience might achieve better results. Throughout the afternoon, James found himself reflecting on the various ways the incident could have unfolded differently. Had he fired the warning shot immediately, the golden retriever might have been startled into even more frantic behavior, potentially creating greater danger for the elderly tourists in the area. The loud report of the rifle would certainly have caused panic among the other visitors, turning a manageable situation into widespread chaos. Alternatively, if he had chosen not to prepare for intervention at all, the consequences could have been severe. The panicked animal had been heading directly toward vulnerable visitors who would not have been able to avoid injury if a collision had occurred. James's readiness to act, combined with his wisdom in choosing the right moment to act, had created the optimal outcome for everyone involved. The incident had also taught James something valuable about the nature of crowd dynamics and crisis management. He had observed how the initial chaos and frantic attempts to help had actually made the situation worse by increasing the golden retriever's stress and panic. When everyone had stepped back and allowed calm to return, the animal had been able to recover its natural equilibrium and make rational decisions. As the day progressed, James noticed that his fellow guards were treating him with a subtle but noticeable increase in respect. In the military culture of the Queen's Guard, recognition was rarely expressed openly, but James could sense that word of his handling of the incident had reached his colleagues and had been received with approval. During the ceremonial changing of the guard that afternoon, James felt a heightened sense of connection to the traditions and responsibilities he represented. The precision of the drill movements, the coordination with his fellow guards, and the dignified ceremony observed by hundreds of tourists all seemed to carry additional weight and meaning. After the morning's demonstration of practical application of military values, the crowd watching the changing of the guard was larger than usual for an autumn afternoon, and James suspected that word of the morning's incident had drawn additional visitors who hoped to see the guard would handle the situation with such professional skill. Several photographers seemed to be focusing particularly on James, and he could see people pointing him out to their companions. After the ceremony concluded and James returned to his post, he was approached by a castle administrator who rarely spoke directly with individual guards. The man, dressed in the formal attire that marked him as senior castle staff, spoke quietly and professionally. "Corporal Mitchell, I wanted to personally commend you for your handling of this morning's incident. Your judgment and restraint prevented what could have been a serious injury to our visitors, while also demonstrating the very best qualities of the Queen's Guard. Your actions reflected great credit on yourself and on the regiment." The commendation was formal but sincere, and James recognized that his superiors had taken notice of not just what he had done, but how he had done it. The combination of readiness to act with wisdom about when to act represented exactly the kind of judgment that was valued in positions of responsibility and trust. As the afternoon wore on, James was surprised to receive a visit from an unexpected source. The family with the golden retriever had returned to the castle grounds, though this time their beloved pet was secured with a proper harness and leash that would prevent any repeat of the morning's escape. The father approached James's position during a quiet moment when few tourists were in the immediate area. He carried himself with the respectful bearing of someone who understood military protocol and didn't want to create any disruption to the guard's duties. When he spoke, his voice carried genuine emotion and gratitude. "Corporal, I hope you don't mind us coming back. We wanted to thank you properly for what you did this morning. My name is David Thompson, and this is my family." He gestured toward his wife and children, who stood at a respectful distance with their now calm golden retriever beside them. James maintained his ceremonial position but acknowledged the family's presence with the slight nod that protocol allowed. In such circumstances, his eyes briefly met those of the golden retriever, who seemed completely transformed from the panicked animal of the morning. The dog was alert and interested in its surroundings, but showed none of the stress or anxiety that had triggered the earlier incident. David continued, his words carefully chosen to express the depth of his family's appreciation. "We realize now that Max could have been seriously hurt or could have hurt someone else. When we saw you raise your rifle, we thought, well, we were terrified about what might happen. But then you waited, you gave him a chance to calm down, and you made the right choice. That took incredible judgment and restraint." The man's wife stepped forward slightly, adding her own words of gratitude. "Our children have been talking about you all day. They understand now that you were protecting everyone, including Max. You showed them what real strength looks like. Knowing when not to act is just as important as knowing when to act." James found himself deeply moved by the family's return and their thoughtful expression of appreciation. In his years of ceremonial duty, he had received thanks from tourists for photographs and brief interactions, but this was different. This family understood the complexity of the decision he had faced and the skill required to navigate such an unprecedented situation. The golden retriever, as if sensing that this meeting was significant, sat calmly beside the family and looked up at James with what appeared to be recognition. The animal's demeanor was completely relaxed and friendly, showing none of the stress indicators that had been so prominent during the morning's incident. David reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope, which he placed on the ground near James's post in a way that would not require the guard to break protocol by accepting it directly. "We've written a formal letter of commendation that we're sending to your commanding officers. We wanted them to know exactly what happened and how professionally you handled it." The gesture touched James more than he could express while maintaining his ceremonial duties, the family's understanding of military protocol, their recognition of the complexity of his decision-making process, and their effort to ensure that his superiors would receive a detailed account of his actions demonstrated a level of thoughtfulness and appreciation that was rare. As the family prepared to leave, David spoke one final time. "We're from Canada, visiting London for the first time. This morning could have ruined our entire trip and created terrible memories for our children. Instead, because of your professionalism and wisdom, our kids learned something valuable about courage, judgment, and doing the right thing even when it's difficult. Thank you for that gift." The children waved shyly at James as they left, and the golden retriever gave a gentle wag of its tail before walking calmly away with its family. The contrast between this peaceful departure and the chaotic scene of the morning could not have been more dramatic. After the family left, James retrieved the envelope they had left and found a moment to read its contents during his next scheduled break. The letter was articulate and detailed, describing not only what had happened, but the family's understanding of the split-second decision-making and professional judgment that had been required. The letter concluded with words that would stay with James for the rest of his career. Corporal Mitchell demonstrated that true military bearing is not just about ceremony or tradition, but about the wisdom to know when strength should be shown through restraint rather than action. This decision to prepare for intervention while allowing the situation to develop naturally showed the highest level of professional judgment we have ever witnessed. Word of the family's return and their formal commendation spread quickly through the castle's administrative offices and military command structure. James's immediate superiors were impressed not only by his handling of the original incident, but by the lasting positive impression he had made on civilians who had witnessed his professionalism under pressure. The incident was becoming part of the informal history and tradition of the Queen's Guard, the kind of story that would be told to new recruits as an example of the judgment and character expected of those who served in such prestigious positions. It demonstrated that the skills required for ceremonial duties extended far beyond drill movements in uniform. Maintenance to include the kind of rapid decision-making and crisis management that could arise without warning. As evening approached, and James's shift neared its end, he reflected on how a routine morning of ceremonial duty had become a defining moment in his military career. The Golden Retriever had unknowingly provided him with an opportunity to demonstrate and develop qualities that went to the heart of what it meant to be a professional soldier: the ability to remain calm under pressure, to make sound judgments quickly, and to choose the most appropriate response from a range of possible actions. The incident had also reinforced James's understanding of the symbolic importance of his role. To the hundreds of tourists who visited the castle each day, the Queen's Guard represented not just British military tradition, but the values of discipline, professionalism, and service that those traditions embodied. His handling of the crisis had provided a real-world demonstration of those values in action. The day had transformed from a routine assignment into a profound learning experience that would influence James's approach to his duties and his understanding of leadership for the rest of his career. The Golden Retriever's moment of panic had created an opportunity for human wisdom, restraint, and professional judgment to shine, creating a memory that would be treasured by everyone who witnessed it. 6 months later, James stood in the same position at Windsor Castle, but everything had changed in ways both visible and profound. The incident with the Golden Retriever had become legendary within the Queen's Guard, a story told and retold in training sessions, mess halls, and formal ceremonies as an example of the kind of judgment and character that defined the regiment's finest members. The formal recognition had come swiftly and at the highest levels. James had been personally commended by his commanding officer, received a letter of appreciation from the castle's head of security, and been featured in the regiment's quarterly newsletter as an example of professional excellence under pressure. But more meaningful to James than any formal recognition was the way the incident had changed his understanding of his role and responsibilities. The story had spread beyond military circles through various channels. The Canadian family's detailed letter of commendation had been shared with military historians who documented exceptional examples of judgment and restraint in action. Military academies had requested copies of the incident report to use as a case study in crisis management and decision-making under pressure. James had been invited to speak at several training sessions for new recruits, where he would carefully walk through the thought processes and split-second assessments that had led to his decision. These presentations always emphasized the same key points: the importance of preparation combined with the wisdom to know when action was truly necessary, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest strength is demonstrated through restraint rather than force. The rifle was ready, James would tell the young soldiers. My training was complete, my aim was true, and I could have fired that warning shot in a fraction of a second. But the situation taught me that having the ability to act is only half of professional competence. The other half is having the judgment to know when action will help and when patience might achieve better results. The incident had also attracted attention from unexpected quarters. James had received letters from dog trainers, animal behaviorists, and veterinarians who had heard the story and wanted to commend his understanding of animal psychology and stress response. They explained that his instinctive decision to allow the Golden Retriever time to calm itself had demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how panic affects behavior and how calm environments can facilitate natural recovery. One letter from a prominent animal behaviorist at a London university had been particularly meaningful. Your decision to maintain readiness while allowing the situation to develop naturally showed an intuitive understanding of animal psychology that many professionals take years to develop. The Golden Retrievers. Recovery was possible precisely because you created space for its natural resilience to operate. The story had even reached international military circles through various professional networks and exchanges. James had received correspondence from guards at other royal residences, military ceremonial units from allied nations, and even civilian security professionals who had heard about his handling of the incident and wanted to understand the decision-making process he had used. Perhaps most remarkably, the incident had led to changes in training protocols for ceremonial guards. The Queen's Guard now included specific instruction about managing situations involving distressed animals, crowd dynamics during crisis situations, and the importance of assessing whether immediate intervention was necessary or whether allowing circumstances to develop might produce better outcomes. James had been asked to help develop these new training modules, drawing on his experience to create scenarios that would help future guards understand the complexity of real-world decision-making. The training emphasized that ceremonial duties could involve the same kind of rapid assessment and professional judgment required in any military situation. On this particular morning, as James stood at his post, he noticed a familiar figure approaching across the castle grounds. David Thompson, the Canadian father from the Golden Retriever incident, was walking toward the castle entrance with his family. They had returned to London for another vacation, and James could see the same beautiful Golden Retriever walking calmly beside them. Now wearing a professional-grade harness that would prevent any repeat of the previous year's escape. As the family passed near James's position, David caught his eye and nodded with a smile that conveyed continued gratitude and respect. The Golden Retriever, now older and perhaps wiser, looked up at James with what appeared to be recognition and wagged its tail in a friendly greeting. The contrast with the panicked, distressed animal of 6 months earlier could not have been more complete. The children, now a year older, whispered excitedly to each other as they recognized the guard who had become part of their family's story about their London adventure. James could hear fragments of their conversation. "That's him. That's the guard who helped Max. He's the one who knew not to scare Max more. He's the one who made the right choice." After the family had passed, James reflected on how that single morning had transformed his career and his understanding of what it meant to serve. The incident had demonstrated that the skills required for ceremonial duties extended far beyond drill movements and uniform maintenance to include the kind of rapid decision-making, crisis management, and human judgment that could arise without warning in any situation. The Golden Retriever had unknowingly provided James with an opportunity to discover and demonstrate qualities he hadn't known he possessed. The ability to remain calm while preparing for action, to assess a rapidly developing situation accurately, and to choose the most appropriate response from multiple options had proven to be as important as any technical military skill. More than that, the incident had shown James that his role as a Queen's Guard carried responsibilities that extended beyond ceremony and tradition to include real-world protection of people who trusted in his professionalism and judgment. Every tourist who visited the castle was placing their safety in the hands of guards who might be called upon to make split-second decisions that could prevent injury or tragedy. The story had become part of James's identity and legacy, but not in ways that made him proud in a personal sense. Instead, it had reinforced his understanding that individual recognition was less important than the collective reputation and capability of the regiment he served. His actions had reflected credit on all Queen's Guards, demonstrating the kind of character and judgment that the position was meant to represent. As his shift continued, James found himself thinking about the nature of moments that define careers and character. The incident with the Golden Retriever had lasted only minutes, but its impact had extended far beyond that brief period of time. It had become a teaching tool, a source of pride for his regiment, and a reminder that preparedness and judgment were equally important in military service. The afternoon brought the usual stream of tourists, photographers, and visitors who came to witness the pageantry and tradition of the Queen's Guard. But James now understood more deeply what they were really seeing, not just colorful uniforms and ceremonial drill, but living representatives of values like discipline, service, the wisdom to make difficult decisions under pressure. When James's tour of duty ended that evening, he walked away from Windsor Castle, carrying with him the satisfaction that comes from duty well performed and recognition well earned. The incident with the Golden Retriever would always be remembered as a defining moment in his career, but more importantly, it had taught him lessons about judgment, restraint, and professional excellence that would guide him throughout his military service and beyond. The question that had been posed in the minds of everyone who witnessed that morning's months ago, whether the guard's decision to aim but not shoot had been the right choice, been answered definitively through time and reflection. James's shot, the shot he chose not to take, had indeed created a moment that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. It had demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful action is the decision not to act, and that true strength is often shown through restraint rather than force. The golden retriever, now peacefully enjoying another London vacation with its loving family, had unknowingly provided a lesson in wisdom, patience, and the kind of professional judgment that defines the very best military service. The moment when James took aim in silence had created not just a memory, but a legacy of excellence that would inspire future guards for generations to come.